Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salam, hello, welcome to you all, and peace to everyone. Welcome to the program. I'm Adnan Hussein, historian of the medieval Mediterranean and Islamicate world. Back for another edition with a very important and interesting interview ahead with a wonderful guest. I've been looking forward to this for a very long time. In fact, actually, even before he became extremely famous as a political figure, his scholarship was something that was inspirational and very interesting to me. And so I've been looking forward to this a long time. And the real connection was made with Jared Ball, who's a wonderful, colleague and scholar who put me in touch with my guest. And also because my parents met him in San Jose, California at a fundraising dinner for his campaign. So by now you know who I'm talking about, I think, perhaps, but I'm talking about Dr. Butch Ware, who is a professor of the history of West Africa and Islam at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And his work has focused on what it is meant to be an African Muslim from a variety of different approaches. He's author of an amazing book, The Walking Quran, Islamic Education, Embodied Knowledge and History in West Africa, and Jihad of the Pen with several other colleagues, The Sufi Literature of Africa, which is an invaluable collection of really incredible writings by West African Muslim scholars. And I think we're going to end up talking about some of them, I hope, inshallah. So, Butch, welcome to the program. It's a pleasure to have you.
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. It's really, I'm glad we can make this this call happen. Excited to be on here. I just love the fact that you want to talk about the academic work and the scholarship, because ever since I got pulled into electoral politics, it feels like I get few opportunities. Dr. Ball is one of the people that also gave me an opportunity to kind of connect the two pieces. So glad to be linked through our illustrious colleague, and glad to also get the chance to meet your folks in San Jose.
Yes, alhamdulillah. And that was obviously when you were the 2024 Green Party vice presidential candidate, and you are currently running for governor in the great state of California. So we will, inshallah, talk about that at some point. But I first wanted to start with how you became a scholar of West African Muslim societies and of Islam in Africa.
Yeah, I think that the way that I would start this story would probably be with my conversion experience. When I was 15 years old, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I read that book cover to cover in one night, could not put that book down. Actually, Malcolm is over my shoulder, quite literally almost all the time. I keep, Malcolm's books and pictures and speeches around me. And the short version of the story is that I had experienced a lot of the things that Malcolm described in his autobiography. Malcolm was brutally honest about how dark some of the experiences that he had had in his life were. And I had faced a lot of the kind of the business end of white supremacy since childhood, right? I mean, I never lived at the same street address for a calendar year until I was 9, really crushing poverty in Washington, D.C., which was a incredibly segregated, 95% Black city at that point in time. And the short version is that I wanted what Malcolm had when he got to the end of that book. And Malcolm had this kind of complete and total liberation, not only from his external oppressors, but also all of his inner oppressors, his inner demons. And so I went out and checked out an English translation of the Quran from my public library the next day. And I read Malcolm's autobiography cover to cover in one night. So I literally had not slept, and I went out and got an English translation of the Quran. I read that cover to cover the next night. And when my mom got home from work, because then I did actually sleep and skip school because I slept right through school the following day. When my mom got home from work, I said, "Mom, I need you to give me a ride to a to this mosque because I'm a Muslim now. I want to take my shahada." Like I made up my mind. And, so the reason why I'm relating this long version of the story is that for me, my introduction to Islam as a faith tradition was through Malcolm. And that was also my induction into the Black liberation tradition, which helped me make sense of a lot of the pain and trauma that I had experienced in youth. And it was actually Malcolm that pushed me to study Africa, because Malcolm had this line. He said, if a cat has kittens in an oven, that don't make them biscuits. And your people hear it and they're like, what? They're like, what does this mean? But then he continues. He said, you call yourself a Negro. Show me Negro land on a map. Negro, you come from Africa. Call yourself an African. And so Malcolm was always pushing people to investigate their African origins of African American society. So he was really the first person to put Africa in my head as a potential object of study and as a way of like unpacking, how to understand Blackness in, kind of broader historical trajectory than just the crushing experience of American racism and white supremacy.
That's fascinating. I mean, Malcolm X is also just so close to my heart since I was 12 years old and read his autobiography also
Yep.
In one night. And it's just so compelling. And partly because what he has to say is so true and truthful. There's a ring of absolute truth that comes from his analysis of everything that's wrong with white supremacist American society. And as a young Muslim, not of, African heritage, but as, somebody who grew up, in the United States, seeing it as a racial regime and knowing and feeling that in many ways being a Muslim somehow put me outside of its, Americanness. The fact that he was willing to say that he wasn't an American, meaning politically speaking, he's not an American.
Right.
He can't be part of this project. So that, definitely opened up my eyes also to a critical vantage, politically speaking. But it also took you, like him, to Africa. And he had famous, travels in Africa that were very kind of important and eye-opening in West Africa as well. And, in your work, you seem to be taking on some of the big themes that he might have been concerned with in a way, which was how to, and this is a question that I have for you as somebody who's a political candidate, is working in radical politics, but also have faith and religious identity. Very often on the left, there's discomfort with how to put faith and politics together in a meaningful and in a powerful way. And I just and that's something that Malcolm X did very successfully.
Yep.
And I wanted to just ask you a little bit more about how you see those coming together and relating to one another.
Oh man, that is such a fantastic question, because it literally takes me back to that night, right? Back to back nights. And so what you said about Malcolm's autobiography is true. It's incredibly powerful and true. And I've always believed, and I still believe, that it's the most powerful narrative of spiritual redemption ever penned in the English language, right? Like, it's just this universal story. So even if you're neither Black nor Muslim, you're going to find the truth in it because it's just powerfully true. What I found when I read the Quran the next night was the most powerful, narrative, the most powerful story of kind of universal redemption, right? Like it's this, but they were similarly radical. Like, I still to this day believe that the Quran is the most radical manifesto in, ever to hit the hearts of human beings. Because what I saw in the Quran, that reading the next night, was Abraham, peace be upon him, standing 10 toes down against Nimrod of Babylon, right? Motivated by faith to stand for justice. I saw Moses and Aaron, from an oppressed tribe, standing in front of the most powerful tyrants on the face of the earth, the most powerful imperialist on the face of the earth in their time. And because of the courage of their convictions, they stood and spoke. Even though Moses said that he was afraid, right? He didn't want to have to bear this burden, but he understood it was a moral obligation to stand against injustice and oppression. Why do we know the names, Yahya and Isa, John and Jesus? Because they did the same in the face of Rome. They stood and spoke a word of truth before Caesar. So for me, the two have always been intimately connected. My political engagements are directly related to my understanding of faith as being, that which orients me towards transcendent value. And transcendent value comes um, from honoring one's basic fundamental moral commitments. And those fundamental moral commitments are led, in point of fact, by keeping needless harm and oppression from reaching the most precious thing that God ever made, which is the human being. Like in the Quran, every Allah yuhib, every God loves that comes in the Quran, the direct object of the verb to love is a human being, right? The human being has this incredible noble stature, and yet human beings are tortured and oppressed by tyrants who believe only in the power of this world. And so for me, it's my belief that there's a metaphysical realm beyond this one where our deeds echo for eternity, right? Malcolm was still teaching me from beyond the grave, still a spiritual presence in my life right down to the present. And so for me, the faith commitments and the political commitments are closely connected. And I think that this is one of the issues that some on the so-called left fail to grapple with, is that, while materialist analysis is excellent and outstanding for understanding capital and understanding power, it is actually transcendent narratives of meaning that go beyond just the material world that have made the most powerful impacts in human history, right? And for me, understanding the relationship between those metaphysical and material dimensions, between inner demons and external oppressors, that is where true liberation work takes place.
Well, we may want to come back to this when we talk a little bit more about your political projects that you're involved with. But I did want to come to the Quran because your first book, very interestingly, and maybe not a very typical choice for how to study the history of West Africa, either, maybe even in religious studies, it might have seemed like, an odd choice, especially because of a lot of the, kind of prevailing views about what, memorization and, kind of rote memorization and so on is, was there something really to study? But the Quran clearly was a very central focus of your interest. And also you found it as a window into many rich kind of stories and phenomena of West African experience, particularly in Muslim societies that you were studying. What was this book really about, and how, what were you trying to accomplish with it? What do you think is the main kinds of things that came out for you from really engaging and studying what you call the embodied kind of study of the Quran in Senegambia? In Senegal and Senegambia.
So I mean, this it's also another really powerful question for me to try to answer. I think that the shortest way to answer the question would be to start with that presumption. Well, what is there really to learn about Quran memorization? It almost seems like an anti-intellectual question. And by the way, that's how my academic mentors, save one, really received it when I first proposed the idea. They were like, well, what do you think you could learn from a history of Bible school, right? Essentially, and my PhD advisor, Steve Fireman, to his credit, really saw the potential in the project from the beginning. But the reason why I undertook it was that I had lived in Senegal, for time as an undergraduate, spent time doing research, in my early years in graduate school in West Africa, had learned to speak the Wolof language fluently. And whenever I spoke to Senegalese and Gambians and other West Africans, they said that this is the most important topic that you could study. And of course, in retrospect, right, and this was one of the things that was said in reviews of the book, and I'll get to those in a moment, but somebody said that there are few questions of more fundamental importance in religious studies than how the sacred text of a religion is learned and taught, right? So we should have understood that this is a really, really important topic. but colonial perspectives on Islamic education and the role of Islam in West Africa obscured the importance of this really, really central institution, to the point where quite literally there were almost no studies written about it. And I started this research, in the late 90s. 1997 is when I was doing the first kind of graduate feasibility studies about doing this research, and then carried out most of the research, living in Senegal for a year and a half in 2001, 2002, and then archival research for years after that. So what I was able to get at, and this is the kind of core contribution of the book as far as I understand it, is that and I was able to really take a decolonial and anti-colonial approach to not just the history, but to knowledge itself, and to root myself in the understandings of knowledge which obtained in West African Muslim society, and to write my way out from inside those understandings to be able to tell stories that were inaccessible from a colonial perspective or from inside Western epistemology. So just to put it this way, I actually do not quote any Western theorists as analysts anywhere in the book. The entire intellectual and philosophical apparatus of the book comes from inside Muslim sources and African sources. And I'm not even trying to explain how an African epistemology or an African and Islamic epistemology functions to Western audiences. In fact, I just described that in the first chapter of the book, what its internal dynamics look like, why embodied knowledge is distinct from analytical, understandings, and how this is a completely different way of knowing and being in the world. That's one chapter. The rest is actually telling a story from inside that ontology, inside that epistemology, and seeing what you see from within it. And when you're inside it, then a bunch of things make sense. You start to understand how West African society is actually orienting its resistance to the rise of the slave trade, how it's orienting its resistance to colonial occupation and imperialism in sacred textual embodiment, that knowing and becoming and living the Quran is actually at the foundation of West African resistance. And now I was right back to where I was with Malcolm, right? That this was about a kind of deep internalization and embodiment of the core ethical principles of the faith, not in an abstract analytical way, but in an embodied, practical, revolutionary way. And the stories that I told, I realized were like hiding in plain sight in source materials that other scholars had looked at, but never understood, because they never looked at how this would have appeared from the interior of the society. They were always looking from the outside in, and therefore it appeared illegible. The last piece I'll say on this, because I've said a lot already, is that move was a profoundly challenging move for academia, right? So there were 3 journals that did entire special editions just to discussing the methodological implications of this book. And I feel like the reason why it made such a big impact in academic worlds, in Islamic studies, in Black studies, in African studies, in African history, was that it presented such a radically decolonial and anti-colonial perspective in the way that it was written and approached. And then that opened up so much decolonial and anti-colonial resistance history, because it was rooted in an epistemology that was seeing itself as, resisting like kind of dominant frameworks of Western thought.
Yes, I mean, I think that's a wonderful way to explain that it wasn't just talking in a decolonial way about stories of resistance, but in fact, actually the methodology of the book and the sources that you use themselves articulated and opened up forms of resistance. And so that's something I did want to explore a little bit more.
Sure.
In particular, is some of the ways in which studying these West African ulama, people of learning, who were trying to embody and live the Quran in a different way.
Many of whom were women, by the way, and that's an important part of the story. You said ulama, people of learning, and that's crucial because that was another part of it, right? But by all means, continue.
Yeah, I did. I didn't want to say men of learning because, there are a lot of other examples. So people, of learning, and it was much more open to different communities and so forth. So that's, I just would be interested in some illustration for people to understand, for example, how it opened up anti-colonial resistance
Yeah.
in a new way, and what were some of the consequences and implications for defending a kind of
Yep.
sovereignty and resisting that kind of oppression.
I think the core contribution of the book in that vein comes in the third chapter, and the third chapter is entitled "The Book in Chains," and it's about Islam, abolition, and republic in West Africa at the end of the 18th century. So the short version is that the overall argument of the book, The Walking Quran, Knowledge. Islamic education, embodied knowledge, and history in West Africa, is borrowed from a hadith where the Prophet, peace be upon him, is described by Aisha as the Quran walking upon the earth, right? That he embodied the ethics and character and values of the text in the way that he moved in the world. And when I was trying to understand like all of the embodied practices surrounding education, it was actually this hadith that I literally dreamt of it, and I heard a voice saying he was the Quran walking upon the earth. And I started writing the next day of like reframing all of these materials as textual embodiment. Why am I going backwards? The reason is that once you start to see the people as the books, right? And books as just ink on paper, but what the real books are, the human beings that carry and embody this text. Then you start to look at those ulama, those learned people, male and female, as like living exemplars of the faith. They're Quran walking upon the earth. They're forms of textual embodiment. And especially in West African society, like for 1,000 years, there's like a scholarly clerisy who is in like a position of critical distance with state power. They have their own kind of social networks and niche that allows them to develop like community and social power that's independent of rulers and kings, and therefore they're often called upon to be critics of the dominant order. So the short version is that with the rise of the Atlantic slave trade, Europeans are killing everyone who resists this new political order, and they're installing warlord leaders that will help with resource extraction the same way that contemporary neo-colonial models work, except that whereas now the goods that are being extracted are coltan and cobalt, before it was literally my ancestors and Malcolm's, right? These were people that were being extracted from these networks. So what happens in West African society is that this slave trade is rising, and there's a bunch of different forms of resistance to it. But the most effective resistance to it comes when kings start to enslave religious scholars, because this is not just a violation of Islamic law. Muslims are never supposed to enslave other Muslims, but it happened all the time, as in different parts of the Muslim world. But what happens is that this is not just perceived as a violation of Islamic law, but as a desecration of the Quran itself. Right? When you start to take living exemplars of the book and torture them, punish them, enslave them, murder them, that galvanizes societal resistance. And that societal resistance literally reaches the point in 1770 where an entire anti-slavery revolution takes place, not just seeking to abolish the Atlantic slave trade, but to end the institution of slavery itself in an Islamic republic that also seeks to end monarchy at the same time. The first abolitionist republic on the planet, 20 years before the Haitian Revolution, 6 years before the American Revolution is going to, frame the stakes of liberty in terms of monarchy, and then make its compromises on slavery, turning some of us into 3/5 of a person. In the Senegal River Valley, there is a full-on Republican revolution, anti-monarchical revolution that also abolishes the institution of slavery and the slave trade at the same time. And it does not get more radical than that. And that story is present in all of the sources from the period, but no one could make sense of the story because they had never looked from the inside of the society to understand like what was actually taking place, what was radicalizing Muslim scholars and formerly enslaved people and peasant farmers to fight against this oppressive imperialist capitalist order.
Yeah, that's amazing, especially since it predates what is often associated with a kind of European Enlightenment narrative. I mean, typically they didn't include the Haitian Revolution, but when they start actually including the Haitian Revolution in this kind of revolutionary age of like, the American Revolution, French Revolution, and then the Haitian Revolution, they don't really kind of embed it in, any of these other kind of West African precursors and traditions that may have been significant and important. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more. That is an amazing chapter, The Book and Chain, Slavery and Revolution in Senegambia, 1770 to 1890. And it starts with this Suleiman Baal and his story. Maybe you could tell readers a little bit, because
Sure.
I doubt, unless they've read it, they've ever heard that there was such a radical experiment and a revolutionary project taking place in West Africa, and that its sources and roots were fully integrated in a kind of Islamic kind of moral economy of claims for justice and against oppression.
Outstanding. So Suleiman Baal, who you referenced, begins this revolutionary movement, in 1770. He is actually killed in revolutionary battle, probably in late 1775. And at that point in time, I should mention that this anti-slavery movement is losing and losing badly. The British are arming Mauritanian slavers to like lay waste to this, new political movement. When Suleiman Baal is killed in battle, a person called Abdul Qadir Khan, who was teaching Islamic law kind of basically in the borderlands between what's now Senegal and Mali, is called in to lead this movement. And he's referred to in the contemporary sources as Al-Mami Abdul Qadir. Al-Mami is just El Imam. It's the Fulani rendering of this, new position. No kings, no sultans. You're just a leader, an elected representative of the people. So Abdul Qadir Khan is actually mentioned by the founder of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade as his principal inspiration in founding modern European abolitionism. The Reverend Thomas Clarkson is the founder not just of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, but also La Société des Amis des Noirs, the Society of the Friends of the Blacks, which is the first modern French abolitionist institution. He founds both of them, and he writes in both French and in English the history of Abdul Qadir Khan's revolutionary success. And he says that this African Muslim ruler has done more for the causes of liberty, humanity, justice, and religion than any of the sovereigns of Europe. He writes these words in 1789. A precursor to what will eventually become the 1807 British and American abolitions of the international slave trade. He gives direct credit to African Muslims for inspiring the foundations of European abolitionism, which of course flips Western genealogies of liberation and freedom on their head. And we never should have taken those for granted anyway, because the idea that the people that ran the largest slave trade in human history and the greatest forced migration in human history, the notion that they invented freedom is ridiculous, right off the top of it. So we should have been, questioning this. But there's the smoking gun, right? The founder of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade said, I'm just trying to get Europeans to do what African Muslims have already done in the name of humanity, liberty, justice, and religion, all of these Enlightenment ideals, but they were in the Senegambian context rooted in centuries old Islamic critiques of the institution of slavery itself and then also a particular view of oppression and injustice and the moral obligation for resistance. So that, I think, is the most powerful contribution. And that chapter that is in the Walking Quran was at one point in time a chapter twice that length. I mean, I had to really reduce it to fit it into a book that was about embodied knowledge. And so ever since I finished that book, I've been trying to finish another book that's just on the revolution, because you mentioned the Haitian Revolution just making it into the story of the Age of Revolutions. Well, since I finished the publication of that book, I've been able to find people that literally fought alongside Abdul Qadir Khan against slavery in West Africa, were enslaved when they lost battles, and then were fighting alongside Toussaint Louverture in the Haitian Revolution a couple years later. I've been able to follow lieutenants in Abdul Qadir Khan's army to slave rebellions in Antigua, to plantations in South Carolina and Georgia. The revolution was being exported all throughout the Atlantic world, and it also spread through Islamic West Africa. Usman Dan Fodio, the great northern Nigerian religious scholar, he fights an anti-slave trade revolution in the early years of the 19th century that is modeled very closely on what I was describing in Senegambia. So all of this is just to say that the very history of freedom in the modern world as we know it is largely constructed by African Muslim sensibilities and histories. And that history has been completely erased, sublimated, and subverted, because to this day, it is subversive to suggest that Africans in particular, and Muslims especially, would be foundational in the way that we understand liberty and freedom and all of these ideals that the West likes to espouse. The West always wants to pretend that it teaches these things to the world, and it especially cannot accept the notion that it would have learned these things from the people that it oppresses and describes as some subhuman in the case of Africans, or despotic and backwards in the case of Muslims.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is, I'm very much looking forward to the forthcoming work when you get some time from many other responsibilities and engagements, because exactly as you say, the genealogy of these concepts, political concepts and political theories, tends to write out the Islamic and Muslim potential contributions in these global and world histories.
Yep.
And they're not the only ones, of course, that are written out, but there is a particular characteristic, because of the development in Orientalism and colonial forms of knowledge of, and I would argue, in my own work, that it goes back to kind of the Crusader, kind of
100%.
approach and era, that there is a unique kind of construction of Islam and Muslims as paradigmatic, kind of enemies and outsiders to the tradition. So that, so that, I mean, what you're doing is really reversing kind of the colonial historiography that tried to basically make, after finally, after millions of people have been trafficked, oppressed, killed, brutally, murdered, lives broken, finally in the early 19th century, to put a stop to the slave trade, finally some kind of moral community starts to agitate in the history of, abolition in the West. And then what do? They immediately, kind of target Muslim and Arab slave traders, in East Africa as the big problem, and inflating these, kind of
and immediately make it into a justification for European occupation of the African continent, right? Because that is the rhetorical move that takes place almost immediately. I should just mention my colleague Vincent Brown at Harvard University, the historian Gerald Horne. These are both kind of African American radical intellectuals, have written about the fact that what's driving the British abolition is not a kind of moral awakening, but the insane costliness of putting down slave rebellions over and over and over again. And Gerald Horne, in his history of the American so-called revolution, essentially calls it a counter-revolution, because
Right.
the British are threatening to pull the plug on the endless backing that they've provided for indigenous genocide, of the North American colonists and slavery, because these things are becoming expensive for the crown. And that is really what's driving the American Revolution in its early period. So we really need a thoroughgoing assessment of the age of revolutions. I'm trying to finish that book. They messed around and made me run for vice president, so that has definitely slowed up the production. But that book, it's called the First Atlantic Revolution: Islam, Abolition, and Republic, circa 1776. And it's really designed to try to kind of shatter the mythology about what freedom is and where it comes from.
Yeah, well, I mean, what it'll do is stitch together some of the things that I wanted to do in this conversation, which is to bring it to continuities between the sort of radical resistance, anti-colonial, anti-slavery, abolitionist movements of West Africa into experiences in the Americas and the Black radical tradition. But one thing that seems really important in this context is, if you can trace some of the actual connections between those who fought, in Abdul Qadir Khan's kind of movement with, the Haitian Revolution, it provides a material connection between something that I've always thought and suspected, just intellectually seemed to make sense, that Morisco, for example, resistance against the Reconquista, so-called Reconquista, and the forced conversions that take place, the Muslim resistance, over the course of the 16th century, means to me that there is a kind of like Mediterranean experience that has continuities because of the same Crusader project that was attempting to do plantation style for sugar, in Cyprus, in Palestine. They tried to
Crete,
do
Malta. Yep, exactly.
That's right. So there's this kind of like, Mediterranean experience in which, Islam and Muslim resistance to this kind of Crusader sort of project kind of takes shape and shapes European, Latin Christian and European approaches as they move into the Atlantic, because they're pushed out of the Mediterranean by the Ottomans, by, Salahuddin, you name it. Like there's just the road is closed. So they go and they go into the Atlantic world. And so similarly, all of these slave rebellions and slave revolts, I'm wondering if maybe, I kind of think of the Morisco forced conversions and enslavement and oppression is also a kind of incubation for a pattern that you see also with West African Muslims in the Western Hemisphere being very connected and involved in some of the slave revolts. And we should talk not just about a Black Atlantic, but also maybe a kind of Muslim Atlantic, in terms of resistance.
Yeah, I mean, so you and I need to do like a joint lecture on those connections, because I teach about that kind of Mediterranean sugar plantation complex and the way that it's connected to things that are taking place. But that you would be able to inform me about a great deal of that, and I think we could get a long way in putting those two stories together. The part of it that I know the best is that because of that history that you're alluding to, it's very, very clear, especially for the Vatican and for the Spanish crown in New Spain, right, in what's now Mexico, that Muslims are understood as being particularly dangerous, kind of recalcitrant resistors. There's actually papal bulls in the 15 teens and 1520s that seek to outlaw the importation of Muslim slaves, specifically because they're thought of as being too rebellious. And the part of the backstory of what's taking place in Senegambia, because Senegambia is the first place to get exposed to the Atlantic slave trade, there's actually huge numbers of Fulani and Wolof enslaved people that are being brought to what's now Mexico in the 1550s and 1560s, to the point where there are so many Muslims and they refuse to work on any of the major religious holidays, that all of the major religious holidays in the Muslim calendar are celebrated in Mexico City in the 1530s, 1540s, because Muslims just ain't having it, and they're so frequently associated with rebellion that there are periodic efforts to just, okay, stop bringing those rebellious West African Muslims because they fight this system. So that's a genealogy of resistance that, as you point out, like runs through Mediterranean histories, runs back to the Crusades, and then is expressed in West African resistance in the New World that runs right down into the Haitian Revolution. I'll give you one that our colleague Sylviane Diouf, who wrote a beautiful book a generation ago, Servants of Allah, where she's tracking enslaved Muslims in the New World. Her work is entirely a kind of synthetic work, just based on secondary sources that were already published. And there is a mountain of information about the disposition and sensibilities of these resistant African Muslims that's already present in that story. One of the things that she suggested, and that I think that most historians that are specialists on the topic now really accept as the most likely answer, is that there's direct connections between some of those African Muslim revolutionaries and African American Muslim revolutionaries. The person of Frederick Douglass is probably the most interesting and intriguing character. Frederick Douglass is the most famous abolitionist in 19th century America. Some say he's the most photographed man of the 19th century. People might not know that he's the reason why most Black men don't smile in pictures, because Frederick Douglass was like the most photographed man at a time when photography was new. And he literally said, I never smile in photographs because I don't want them to circulate around the world and people think that the American Negro has something to smile about. So like literally that ice grill, that, serious and stern look, it comes from Frederick Douglass. Well, who was Frederick Douglass? We know that Frederick Douglass's father was a white man, either his mother's owner or some other white man in the immediate environments. He had never actually discovered the true identity of his father, but we know that his mother was a Black woman who had the last name Bailey. Now, he came from the Sea Islands of Georgia and South Carolina, where there are many, many Baileys, and where many, many Muslims, like there's surviving accounts of Muslims all throughout those islands in the late 18th century, early 19th century. An interesting fact is that Douglass chooses his name after a British freedom fighter, but his mother's name was Bailey, as I mentioned. There are no white Baileys in any of those sea islands. The obtaining the current theory is that Bailey is actually an anglicization of Bilali, which is a very common name. There are at least 9 different Bilalis that are found throughout the Sea Islands in that period in the late 18th century, which, if that's the case, connects 19th century African America, most famous abolitionist figure, with those West African revolutionaries that I'm describing. And then let's just go back to Malcolm, sitting over my shoulder. When Malcolm converts to Islam, to the Nation of Islam, a bunch of the ritual prohibitions and other things make sense to him because there's still pieces of Islamic identity, Muslim identity. They're just embedded in Black culture, not anymore as religion, but they're just part of the culture, because at least 10 to 20, perhaps 20% of the enslaved were of Muslim background. And so there's pieces of just Islamic cultural practice that just become part of African American culture more broadly. And so that African Muslim resistance tradition, you can literally draw a line from West Africa through the Haitian Revolution into to slave plantations and rebellions, through to Frederick Douglass, through to somebody like Malcolm, and then Malcolm speaking to me, right, from beyond the grave. In what was this? It would have been 1988. Is when I read the autobiography of Malcolm X. More than 20 years after he had passed.
Wow, amazing. Yeah, well, this is what's so wonderful about history, is that you pull a thread and your whole world looks different, so mashallah, that's really fascinating.
And Malcolm said of history, he said that of all of our studies, history is best qualified to reward our research. That's what Malcolm said about history.
Well, he knew. History matters so much. What is identity based on? What are our visions for the future based on? They're all, rooted in some kind of history and having to understand that history. And we're subjected so much to the distortions of ideological narrations, Eurocentrism, basically history as a kind of white supremacist unfolding. And, undoing all of that damage is, ages of work. And so you've contributed a lot, I have to say. And we're looking forward. You'll have to come back when you, you publish that book, and we'll talk about it even more. But I do want to there's two topics that I want to explore a little bit further with you. One of which is, since we were talking about continuities that you just were mentioning in cultural terms, but also it's just about spirituality. We had started a little bit about, the relationship between, religion and the political, faith and resistance. And, right now in this era of, genocide in Gaza, it's impossible to ignore the significance and the importance of the Palestinian people's faith as fundamental to their resistance to settler colonial violence and genocide. And the spiritual component of that is often not so well understood. But in the phenomenon you talked about, people like Uthman Dan Fodio, the Murids of Senegal, they're typically, and you never find, you don't find Wahhabism and Salafism as having a serious anti-colonial history and genealogy. It's the Sufis that do. And this is, given the way Sufism has been so depoliticized in this kind of spiritual, contemporary, spiritualism. It is spiritual, but for some reason, a lot of contemporary, especially in the West, Muslims turning to tasawwuf and so on, has often been constructed as a removal from politics.
Escapism,
escapism, which makes even more amazing and important the recognition that the work that you've studied, these West African Sufi scholars, they are Sufis and they are radical anti-colonials. They do not, pull back from politics, but rather they infused their politics with a spiritual intensity. I'm wondering, what you would say about the importance and significance of this form of Muslim devotional practice in these political movements.
It cannot be overstated that all of these anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-white supremacist African Muslim freedom fighters were all Sufis, no exceptions. They were all initiated into one or multiple turuq, one or multiple tariqas, and their spiritual commitments framed their resistance. And I should point out that this is not just for West African Muslims, right? You cited Palestine, but the Qassam brigades, right? This is named after a late 19th, early 20th century Tijani Sufi who gets waylaid, on his way to go, resist Italian occupation, ends up in Palestine instead, and is then the resistance is named after him. Abdul Qadir Jazairi, the Algerian freedom fighter, Emir Abdul Qadir, is named, crowned with a ceremonial turban at age 19 as the greatest living heir of Ibn Arabi, the medieval Andalusian Sufi, in his community. And at age 20, he's leading armed resistance against French occupation of Algeria in the 1830s, right? So it's really, really important to understand that truly spiritual people understand the value of humanity, and therefore they cannot stomach any oppression or harm being brought to the most precious thing that God created, the human being. So you find this as a common thread throughout the early modern resistance history of Muslim societies, and it's particularly pronounced in West Africa, but it is not unique to West Africa. Sufis were not otherworldly mystics. They were people who understood that if your faith is sincere, then you accomplish works of justice in the world. You strive to make the world a better place. So that time and time again, like that's what happens, is that the slave trade imposes itself on West African society, and Sufi scholars feel morally compelled to take action against it. You mentioned the Murids of Senegal, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba. Really in many ways, alongside my inner Malcolm, I have an inner voice from Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, because it was his community that really educated me in West African Islam and Sufism from the time I first started going to Senegal in 1996. Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, led nonviolent resistance to French occupation, but resistance nonetheless. And so this has been, a continuous orientation of these spiritual specialists, male and female. I should have mentioned that the Abdul Qadir Khan, this revolutionary jurist and Sufi that I mentioned before, his principal teacher in Islamic law and theology and spirituality was a woman called Khadija bint Muhammad al-Aql al-Daimaniya. She was a Mauritanian, southwestern Mauritanian scholar who still has surviving works of rhetoric and other disciplines that are taught throughout Mauritania. She's largely been forgotten, sadly, in Senegal. But the point of all this is to say that these were male and female scholars and Sufis who took their moral commitments so seriously that they led them to take direct action to make the world a better, more just place. And I feel like that's what's kind of missing from the otherworldly escapism of, kind of the dhikr party, the tea party in suburban, homes, that you now find associated with Sufism. Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, another one of those great Senegambian Sufi leaders, he said the difference between hope in God's mercy and false hope in God's mercy. He said the difference between hope and false hope is that the first of them is accompanied by deeds. In other words, if you really believe the things that you say that you believe, then work good in the world. And there is no more fundamental work of doing good in the world than to keep injustice and oppression from reaching people.
Yeah, well, I imagine that it's exactly those kinds of values that perhaps have informed your own sense and rootedness in the Black radical tradition, and also that have led you into out of the ivory tower, although I don't think you were the kind of scholar who was always just sitting in the ivory tower, of course not.
I never was.
But
Yeah, I never was.
Never was, I'm sure. But actually to go into the public square more directly, and contest in political terms. How do you see this kind of informing both your understanding of the Black radical tradition and how you want to take that forward? And we can talk a little bit more about the governorship.
Yeah.
But broadly, how do you situate those things for yourself?
So again, this goes back to Malcolm, right? So Malcolm is not just bringing me into Islam and to this, approach to Africa and understanding history and trying to recenter who I am in the universe, in spiritual terms and in racial terms isn't the right way, because it's not about race for him anymore. It's about Africa and understanding where you come from. He's also the person that brings me into the Black liberation tradition, the Black radical tradition. And that means then taking on all of the things that come with that. So when I was 19, I organized my first Pan-Africanist revolutionary reading group. And we were reading Walter Rodney and Frantz Fanon, and Aimé Césaire and Amilcar Cabral and all of those Pan-Africanist liberation figures. We were reading the Panthers and just basically taking this kind of Pan-Africanist revolutionary approach. And those two things have always been tethered in my person, right? Like they're anchored in me and my experience and who I am. And so even in academic spaces, like that's been who I am, how I teach, how I move. I teach Black revolutionary history in addition to histories of Islamic education and histories of Africa and so forth. So for me, the connection has always been intimate. And when I got pull, and that also meant that it wasn't just in these academic spaces. It meant that I was always doing activist work, organizing work, community education work outside of the walls of the academy. And that was how I got pulled in to the electoral politics in the first place, is that, in 2020, when George Floyd was murdered, I created a public social media account for the first time. Never had social media before that, but I understood that we were like entering endgame for American empire. I could see the signs, and I wanted all of the stuff that I've been teaching in face-to-face interactions and community to reach as many people as possible. I also understood when Gaza was being attacked in 2021, that I needed to teach people what Malcolm had said about Zionism as white supremacy, and get people to understand that Black freedom struggles and Palestinian freedom struggles were intimately connected. Fast forward to 2023, I was one of the first, kind of public intellectuals to say on October 9th that the October 7th uprising was the modern day equivalent of Nat Turner's rebellion, and that what we were about to see in return was retributions and mass lynchings, and that the fake rape allegations, I called those out from the beginning, because those preceded every mass lynching in the aftermath of any slave rebellion, right? So if you understand, as Malcolm did, and Malcolm said, by the way, in his field notebooks, and this emerges in the brilliant doctoral thesis of my colleague Maitha El-Hassan, Malcolm, when he visited Khan Yunis, he wrote down in his notebooks, he said, this is a white Jewish population being empowered by white imperialists to remove brown Arabs from their lands. Like, Malcolm understood Zionism as a kind of regional variant of white supremacy, right? He understood it as an expression of the very same thing that had led to the Holocaust, that had led to the slaughter of Jews. It was literally just a kind of iteration of white supremacy, the same way that German Nazism was, or British imperialism is, or MAGA, for that matter, right, is just a regional variation of white supremacy. So all of that is to say is that I understood that I had to be public facing with everything that I had of value to teach from the Black liberation tradition about the current moment that we're embedded in. And that meant bringing Walter Rodney and Kwame Ture and Assata Shakur. And I have a revolutionary book club where we read Huey Newton and all of those other great radicals, Frantz Fanon and others. And that was what ended up getting me invited into electoral politics, because it's not something that I ever sought. Like, you can run thousands of hours of me publicly teaching and speaking, and you'll never hear me talking about running for elected office until Jill Stein asked me if I would consider running as the vice presidential candidate. And I'll maybe stop there, because I see that look that you have questions that you want to ask. Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, you should continue and tell us more about how that unfolded. But I did want to say that I think
Please.
Your entry into the race, I found really interesting and compelling, because in this time of genocide, you foregrounded it in a way that, maybe other politicians and people on the left might not have. But even more importantly, it seemed that you understood the logic of what was taking place politically. And you called out, and I think I mentioned this to you just at the before we started recording, that you basically declared that it was over for the Democrats because they had made such terrible mistakes in dealing with in the moral crime of allowing Israeli impunity in unleashing this horrific violence in the genocide had made it impossible for them to actually gain electoral victory. A lot of people just could not process that it would be an important issue. They thought that they could play the usual game and imagine that they could say that they were just slightly better than, Trump would be, all the polling subsequently and studies and analysis shows that that was actually spot on analysis right at that time. And it just reminds me that, Malcolm did, I didn't realize, I have never read his notebooks, but he did publish a short article that I think recapitulated that Zionist logic in the Egyptian Gazette after he came back from his visit to Gaza. And
Yep.
you could see that you could see why he thought history was so important is because it structures politics. And he made all these connections. In fact, he said something so interesting in that article. He said, how can they make a claim for this land on the basis of thousands of years when, the Moors, were
Can the
in
Moors
Spain?
take back Spain now? I mean, like what?
Yeah, exactly. But in any case, well, that was sort of a tangent, but it just you reminded me of that, and so I did want to like ask you,
Yeah.
how your analysis of that election, has further framed why you've gone into the governorship race,
Yeah.
and what you see as the outcomes. What should we have learned from, and what did you
Yeah.
learn from, your run in the as the VP for the Green Ticket in 2024?
Excellent. So the first thing is that it was very, very unexpected. I mean, I interviewed Dr. Jill Stein for my social media platform because most of the Palestinian and Palestinian American activists that I've been connected with, for years, even before 2023, were advocating for Jill's candidacy, against others. And so I interviewed Dr. Jill, and 24 hours later, I get a phone call. My wife and I are coming back from the movies, and they asked me if I can hop on a Zoom, and I see her whole team, and they're like, we'd like you to consider potentially running for the VP, which, to me, was it was a very, very bizarre moment, but I sort of was expecting something akin to it. A friend of mine had asked me if I was being vetted as a potential VP candidate, and I was like, no, I don't know anything about that. But it made sense after the fact. But it meant being pulled into electoral politics with 11 weeks before the election. Right. And I had a very short time to make a decision. And I made the decision ultimately to accept that invitation with a clear understanding that of my own faith commitments. My one of my first teachers in the Moradia community has since passed on. May Allah be pleased with him. He was a spiritual giant, but his son remains a close friend and teacher for me. And I called and asked him what he thought I should do, and he said, "It's not for an elder to leave a staff lying in a public square where anyone might come along and pick it up and use it to strike the people. Better to pick it up yourself for safekeeping and to safeguard the people against the hands of those who would strike." And it was this powerful metaphor from his father about sometimes the necessity of taking up authority in order to keep it out of the hands of unscrupulous people who would use it to do harm. And this coming from a sheikh in the Muradia, with its traditional distance from politics, really, really powerful for me. So that made me consider it, and I eventually accepted because I realized that I was essentially being called into the same fight that I had been writing about in my academic work and teaching about for a couple of decades. I kept talking and writing about these African Muslim scholars who were minding their business, teaching their students, and organizing their communities for benefit. And then the struggle against imperialism and capitalism and white supremacy in their era showed up at their shores and made itself, unavoidable. It was inevitable that if you were seriously a moral person and you were presented with an opportunity to fight, you have to fight. And so I felt like, quite literally, I was being put in a position analogous to that of Abdul Qadir Khan or analogous to that of Uthman Danfodio. And I'm nowhere near the measure of those kinds of humans, but the God that judges them is the same one that judges me, right? And so therefore, I am accountable for doing whatever I can. So I accepted the invitation. Now, to your point, why did I know that the Democrats were finished? Because again, political analysis, reading the history, and then informing yourself. So I got access to polling data in the Muslim community that showed that in 2020, Joe Biden got 65% of the Muslim vote in swing states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. and that he needed every last one of those Muslim votes in order to barely win in those swing states. And that in 2024, the Democrats were polling at 12% in those same states in the Muslim community. And when I saw that, I was like, oh, they're dead. They cannot win the election. There's no path for them. And later you found that Kamala's own team said that they never had internal polling that said that they could win, which is insane because they spent $1.5 billion in 107 days and they knew the whole time that they could not win, right? I mean, a massive, waste of resources and time and a just, dramatic failure in every conceivable way. But it wasn't, anything like I didn't have a crystal ball. It was just obvious that with the departure of the Muslim community over the issue of Gaza, that the base that the Democrats had depended on to get elected in previous cycles was never coming back. And in point of fact, the exit polling conducted nationwide by CAIR, Council on American Islamic Relations, immediately, during the elections, indicated that 53% of American Muslims voted for the Green Party ticket, voted for Stein Ware, and only 20% for Team Blue Genocide, 20% for Team Red Fascism. So it ended up being the case that even if you gave Kamala all of those third-party votes in all of the swing states, she still wasn't going to win. It wasn't, in fact, the Muslims opting out. It was the fact that even the so-called Democrat base could not stomach this genocide. But in the end, the outcome was the same. And I made a second prediction that, so I saw the first one come true. I said they have no path to victory. I said that on August 10th or something crazy. And people thought I was crazy for saying it, but I was like, no, this is obvious. This is going to happen. The only other prediction that I made during the campaign was that I think that the Democrats are actually going the way of the Whig Party. The Whig Party was the liberal party before the Civil War, and the emergence of an abolitionist party, which was the Republicans at that time, made a liberal party that was complicit in the extension of slavery. It essentially destroyed the Whig Party and replaced it. And I actually don't think the Democrats will ever recover from Gaza. I think the Democrats died in Gaza, and good riddance, because no supposedly, liberal party that is complicit in Holocaust and genocide and the most heinous crimes against humanity that any of us have ever witnessed should ever recover from what it's done. The word Democrat to me sounds just like the word National Socialist. You're just a Nazi to me. And because you are guilty of all of the same things that they were guilty of. And they're drenched and absolutely covered in blood. And I was never attached to them. Malcolm, said of the Democrats, he said to the Black community in '64, he said, you put them first and they put you last. And that makes you a political chump. Malcolm never believed in the Democrats. None of the Black radical tradition ever believed in the Democrats. So I was never attached to the Democrat. I was never a Democrat, never a liberal. And so to see them destroying themselves, I don't have any sadness about it, but it will be a historical fact. They'll never recover from what they've done.
Yeah, I agree that it's absolutely impossible for a party that they're more susceptible to collapse from it because they are, as Malcolm said, the foxes, the Democratic foxes, trying to be cunning, but are actually completely hypocritical. When that's exposed, they're going to suffer more damage than the Republican wolves, the fascist, wolves, because that those were fascists from the very beginning. So, I think that's right. What do you've decided after that experience, to continue down the road of politics. And you are running for governor in the state of California. What are you carrying forward from the VP experience into the governorship? It's a different kind of race. How do you think you're going to be able to communicate your message, and what kind of a program are you running on you were, this is an opportunity for you to define your own candidacy
Yes.
completely. Although I have to say, as a VP, you came across very, independent and strong with, like, your views. I remember you being on some programs, like the, what was it, the Breakfast Club.
Breakfast Club. Yeah.
That's right. I mean, and basically, it was a great opportunity for you to really open up some eyes. I remember one thing that you said on that program that I think must have really stunned a lot of people, but was rooted in your historical analysis, which was about Black identity
Yeah.
is not a racial,
No.
it's not in a narrowly racial, it's a historical category.
Yes.
That was a
Well,
brilliant point. Yeah.
Well, what I said was that I said that I was personally offended by Kamala Harris's weaponization of Black identity in service of
That's right.
white supremacist genocide. Because if you understand Zionism as white supremacy and you see that Kamala is like weaponizing Black identity in order to, paper this over, it directly goes against what Blackness is. Because you got to understand that Blackness as an identity emerges before race is even the dominant category through which Europeans are thinking about anti-Blackness. That's really a late 18th, and essentially 19th century framing. The slave trade comes before that, and it's rooted in a bunch of other, forms of othering and anti-Blackness, but it's not a scientific category of race. So the resistance identity to white supremacy that Blackness is does not depend on race or race thinking in order to justify its existence. And I've argued, I haven't written about this yet, but I've taught about this for years, that one of the biggest things that defangs Black liberation potential is its acceptance of race as a framing for Black identity, right? Because now you're taking this really, really bad and dangerous European eugenics category and, using it for yourself. Black identity is a resistance category to white supremacy. And so it violates, the basic meaning of Blackness to then weaponize Blackness in service of white supremacy. And that was the part that made me crazy. So bringing that forward is into the gubernatorial campaign is essentially an understanding that you said it. Malcolm called them foxes and wolves. Malcolm said of the liberals, the Democrats, and he said the liberal is a fox. It bares its teeth. You think that it's smiling at you, but you are on the menu. The conservative is a wolf. When it bares its teeth, it's into a vicious snarl that leaves the Black man with no illusion as to where he stands. And Malcolm said in 64, the Ballad of the Bullet, he said, the white liberal is the most dangerous thing in the Western Hemisphere. So Malcolm perceived that a hidden enemy, an enemy that pretends to be your friend, is more dangerous to you than an open enemy. Because an open enemy, you defend yourself. Whereas a hidden enemy, one that pretends to be your friend, you allow it close. And so Malcolm was essentially positioning the Black community in 64 as being caught between two predators that differ only in the modality of the hunt. They differ only in the way that they hunt, but they both are seeking to consume you. I think that we've reached the point now where most working class people across this country, and especially in the state of California, understand that these two political parties are corporate capitalist owned parties that are really now just consuming everyone. It's not just Black people. It's not just indigenous people. It's not just immigrants. It's also working class people, from across the spectrum that are now caught between those two predatory forces and those two predatory parties. And to this day, people do not understand that despite the effort to frame the political conversation in America between blue and red, 40% of Americans, registered voters, identify themselves as independents. Only 30% identify as Democrats, 25% as Republicans. The biggest group is still the people that don't see themselves as reflected in either of these two parties. So I'm running a campaign that for me is essentially modeled on Malcolm and on all of those Black resistance heroes. Malcolm said in 64, he said, I'm going to knock on every door in Harlem And we're going to register every black face behind every door, not as a Democrat, not as a Republican, but independent. Malcolm wanted off of the duopoly plantation. He wanted political power to not be centered in either of these two capitalist, imperialist, white supremacist parties, because the reality is that they've both been complicit in genocidal war, especially against Muslim populations in Iraq and Afghanistan and Palestine, in Sudan and Somalia, all over the place, right? Those are bipartisan genocides. And that same bipartisan group has been faking, for lack of a better word, a culture war to keep people divided, so that they stay distracted by this factional fight inside the corporate, the corporate ruling class. And instead of arguing about things like, why do we not have universal health care? How come, we can't get affordable housing? How come all of these things that matter to the American people are never addressed by our politicians? Instead, it's just blue versus red, blue versus red. And in the state of California, just like in a lot of other places, ordinary people have had enough of it. So the idea is that I'm just running to give people an opportunity to vote for something other than predators that wear blue or predators that wear red. And so the campaign is, really focused on like giving people an actual opportunity for not just a leftist politics, but like actual representative democracy, because the stuff that we're running on, which is usually conventionally associated with the left, these are 70, 30, 80, 20 issues with people in California. Nobody wants our elected officials to be obedient to Israel. Right? They want them to be responsible to the people. Nobody wants elections to go to the candidate that spends the most money. They want campaign finance reform, and they want the money out of politics. So we're running just on, not as liberal extremists or conservative extremists, but essentially like running on the things that are serving working class people. For me, it's not about left versus right. It's about top versus bottom.
Well, how can people follow your work and get involved in the campaign and support you and when is the election scheduled for governorship in
the
California?
whole election is really the primary, which is on June 2nd, 2026. So just remember this, 6/2/26. That's the date. And the reason why I bring that out is that the Democrats and Republicans have created a jungle primary where only the top two candidates advance, which is designed to produce one red versus one blue so that the system reproduces itself. But in California, that can backfire, because there are actually more registered independents than there are registered Republicans. And the last second place finisher only got 17% of the vote in that primary. And that created a one-on-one matchup between them and the Democrat incumbent. In this situation, there's no incumbent. Gavin Newsom has termed out. The Democrat field is very, very mediocre, and the Republican field is even worse. So if we're able to get about 20% of the vote on June 2nd, 2026, it is going to create a one-on-one matchup between me and whichever Democrat emerges at the top of that group. It's been Katie Porter, although Katie Porter is really imploding lately. She's had some really, really embarrassing things take place. But all of that is just to point out that once it's a matchup, a blue versus green matchup, then they can't use the lesser of two evils argument. They can't use the, you're going to turn the state over to the Republicans argument. That is off the table. So even if you don't believe that I can win, even if you don't share every element of my politics, come out and vote on June 2nd, 2026 anyway, because then at least you're going to create a circumstance where I'm going to be on every single debate stage between June and November, and national politics are going to have to listen to this loud Black Muslim revolutionary voice that is speaking for ordinary working people. And at the very least, that is going to push the Democrats that some continue to believe in, for God only knows what reason, that's going to push them to at least respond to ordinary working people's demands and the kind of, basic bread and butter politics. Whereas if you endorse the status quo and it's just a Democrat versus a Republican, again, you are going to see that Democrat chasing the Republican to the right, just the way that Kamala was recruiting the Liz Cheneys of the world, and so forth, onto the platform. So come change history on 6-2-2-6, because that is going to create a June to November electoral cycle next year that will literally change American history. And you can find us at butchwareforgov.com. That's BUTCHWARE, the number 4 GOV, and then .com. And I'm on socials, all of them. It's just at Butchware.
So you'll be able to participate on all those debates, which is often a big problem for Green candidates, third-party candidates. Because of this jungle primary, you will be able to participate in a lot of those events. That's great.
Yeah, and if I could just add, so for the gubernatorial candidate forums that have happened so far, because we got almost 1 million votes when the votes were finally tallied for the White House. It's actually been very difficult for them to keep me out of that. We've literally had people say that we're not allowing minor parties to participate in the debate, but you're allowed to participate in the debate because you're a major candidate, even if you're in a supposedly minor party, because there is no one else that's gotten 1 million votes for the White House that's running for governor in the state of California. And that has been very, very bad for the Democrats so far. Like, for example, the SEIU Local 1000 is the largest state employee union in the state of California. When we did that candidate forum, there's 1,000 people in the room. It was being streamed to a half dozen other union halls throughout the state. And it's me up there with Katie Porter and the other Democrats, 3.5 hours answering questions. When they closed the door and did the vote, we had people inside the room. They said, you won best candidate, hands down. In fact, everybody just talked for 10 minutes about how badly you beat everyone else, to the point that the leadership then said, we get it. We know Butch won the debate. What else do we want to take from this debate? Right? Like, that's how bad it is every time we're on stage at the same time. And that's going to keep happening because they're incredibly mediocre candidates. They're out of touch. And importantly, they're all on the Zionist payroll. And across the ideological spectrum, from left, right, independent, in the middle, hardcore leftists, nobody wants Zionists to be running their politics anymore. And so we've got a real opportunity. And by the way, if we break them in California, they're broken. Like that prediction that I made about the Democrats going the way of the Whigs, it is in our hands in the state of California to have the first domino in that process fall. And people are going to be fearful of that. But I just want people to understand that the Democrats are the most effective counterinsurgency movement in modern history. They are actually the thing that sits between us and a true opposition party to fascism. Because of that culture war that they have to stage, they dramatically inhibit the growth of an ordinary working class politics. Once they're out of the way, the coalitions that we can form can outnumber the Republican base 3 and 4 to 1. Right now, it is paradoxically the liberal party that is doing the most to guarantee that we have fascism. Once they are out of the way and we're no longer, caught in this false dichotomy between liberal and conservative, it's just going to be, wait a minute, are you with the working class or are you with the ruling class? Are you with working people or are you with the corporations? And in that environment, all of us, especially Muslims and oppressed minority communities, are going to be better protected.
Well, this is a time where many things have been clarified in this time of genocide. And one thing that's being clarified, as you're pointing out, is the role of the liberal Democrats in sustaining and advancing, actually, the cause of fascism. And so, we can only hope that more and more people are waking up to the realities of the situation, as all of the liberal illusions, the claims about international law, democracy, human rights. I mean, these things are being torn asunder by the reality of what's been happening. And so you're right that this is a time of great political opportunity. So we have to be very thankful that you're running and putting the case to the people in the state of California. And having you up on the debate stage, all I can say for the other candidates is I pity those fools, because it's going to be rough trying to be able to, kind of answer the real kind of questions that you're putting. So I want to thank you so much, Butch, for joining me on the program today. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you about your scholarship and to hear about your political orientation. I hope that my listeners and watchers to this program will go find you, if they don't already follow you on social media, and find your website and support you. Make a donation. If you're in the state of California, you could sign up to be a volunteer, in the campaign.
Even if you're not in California, you can volunteer. A lot of our volunteers and donors are from around the country. If you're in the state of California, we need you to register, but you can help this from wherever you are, truthfully.
Yeah, so wherever you are, make a donation and support. And if you can volunteer, that's great as well. And all Californians, make sure to register to vote. I just want to tell people that this will be part of not only the Adnan Hussein Show on YouTube, but also in the Guerrilla History, African Revolutions, and Decolonization series. And again, I want to thank all of you for listening. You can support the program by going to patreon.com/Adnan Hussein or buymeacoffee.com/Adnan Hussein to support the channel. But it's more important that you do two things. One, give to people in Gaza, and two, get involved with the Butch Ware campaign. So until next time, inshallah, salam and solidarity, peace with justice to you all.